Now that you've finished your critique essay, it's time to move on to the next assignment, the Annotated Bibliography. The Annotated Bibliography is an assignment designed to help you prepare for your final paper, the Argumentative Research paper. The goal of an annotated bibliography is to help you conduct research and specifically to think about how that research will help you in your paper. So this means that before you can complete the annotated bibliography, you do need to settle upon a topic for your argumentative research paper. Now, you can expand upon your critique. If you want to continue with the same topic, you feel that you have your own argument to make about the topic that you researched for the critique, you can certainly pursue that in your final paper and the annotated bibliography. That means that if you take a look back at the two sources that you evaluated in your critique and you decide that yes, they can be used in your final paper, that you have specific ideas about how they could be helpful to you, you can use those two sources in your annotated bibliography, but you will need to think about how can these sources actually be used. In the critique, you decided they were good or bad in various ways. You evaluated the sources in and of themselves. Now you need to think about, are they useful to you to make a certain point in your paper? So you can see that this is not about just conducting research and learning more about a topic, but it's about planning how you can use sources to support your own argument in a paper. So ultimately, the annotated bibliography also serves another function. In the introduction of this assignment, you basically propose your research paper topic. You might not have a solid thesis statement yet, and that is okay. And your topic might even change a little bit as you get into writing the paper itself. But for the annotated bibliography, you do need to say, here's what I'm thinking about arguing in my final paper, so that the sources you include in the annotated bibliography are actually going to be helpful to you. This assignment is not meant to be busy work by any means. It really is a planning document that's going to make it a lot easier for you to write your final paper. The annotated bibliography has a pretty straightforward format. You first have the introduction, and then you have a paragraph for each source. There's no need for a conclusion, and we're going to take a look primarily at how to write the paragraphs for your sources today, because in some ways I think, like with the critique, the introduction can be a bit easier to write last, or at least parts of it are. What I would encourage you to draft out for yourself first is the first section of the introduction. So you can see that the introduction contains primarily three parts. Your idea for your argumentative research paper, the topic that you're going to focus on, what you're hoping to argue, and then your reasons for conducting the research that you detail below, those three sources, and then your plans for additional research as you begin really working on your argumentative research paper. What do you still need to find out more about that the three sources that you discuss in the annotated bibliography might not cover entirely, because you do need at least five sources for the final paper. So steps 2 and 3 of the introduction, you can't really write until you have found your three sources for the annotated bibliography. But step 1, I think these questions are useful for you to think about as you begin or continue your research for the annotated bibliography. So what is the topic you want to focus on? Are you continuing with what you researched for the critique, or do you want to go in a different direction? And then specifically, what is it you are going to try to argue or persuade your reader? What are you taking a position on? What do you have an opinion on? This cannot just be your final paper, rather, cannot just be a report of information. It needs to be an argument, something that you want readers to think about or do, something that someone could disagree with. So you don't have to have a solid thesis statement at this point, but you do want to tell me what you're hoping to focus on, not just I want to write about telemedicine, but what about telemedicine are you going to try to persuade your readers to think or do? Why do you think your topic's important? And that'll develop even more as you write your paper, but this gives you a sense of what to research for. If you don't know what you're going to argue, you don't know what kind of evidence you need from your sources. And it also tells me what you plan on working on so I can give you better advice. And then the other two parts of your intro, I would come back to those after you've written the rest of the paper. So let's take a look at a sample thesis statement. This comes from the earlier page in the module in which I introduced the argumentative research paper, and I gave you a couple of sample ideas of paper topics and some thoughts about how you might conduct research for those topics. So you really do need to know what you want to argue in your paper in order to conduct effective research. So an example topic is telemedicine, but then you need to ask yourself, what do I think about that topic? What do I want to convince my readers of about that topic? And so you might come up with an initial thesis statement that looks something like this. Telemedicine is an important development telemedicine is an important development in the healthcare industry because it can be safer and more convenient for many patients in a number of different ways. That is a thesis statement because it requires explanation, it requires evidence and support. I must prove that telemedicine is not just a passing fad. I must prove that it has benefits in terms of safety and convenience, and I must tell my reader about those and convince them that, those reasons matter. Right? And I would develop perhaps, an even more specific focus and argument as I actually work on the paper, the argumentative research paper. But for the annotated bibliography, this would be part of my introduction. This would be something that would work very well for the intro. And then I would talk a little bit more about why I think this is important, and then why I'm conducting the kind of research that is located in the rest of the annotated bibliography. So what kind of research would I need to conduct for a thesis like this? Well, I talked about this on the previous module page, and something you would need to consider is that telemedicine, even though it's been around for quite a while, it's really only received more widespread attention in recent times because of the coronavirus. So it's a topic that's still new to many people, so I would need to inform them, give them more information about telemedicine, as well as convince them that it's a vital and credible source of treatment for some people. So I might consider what would be maybe the doubts of some of my readers that I would need to address. Maybe they're not sure how effective telemedicine can actually be. Can this guy popping out of the laptop here actually, give me solid medical advice? Or am I going to, lose a thumb or something because he didn't see properly what my symptoms were, right? So you need to think about counter arguments, what people might have to say in response to your argumentative thesis statement. People might also be concerned about data and privacy protections as we share medical information on, Zoom or something that may not be the most stable. They might be concerned about a number of different issues. You don't have to know all of them right now. You don't even have to cover all of them in your paper. You're not writing a book about telemedicine. You don't need to say everything there is to say in its defense. But for this topic, you would need to consider what sorts of information would my reader need in order to believe me when I say that this is a safe, convenient, and important form of treatment that's developing. So I needed my paper to convince my reader of the benefits and address at least some of the drawbacks or concerns that my readers might have. Now, I would probably be arguing not for telemedicine to replace, live in-person appointments, but that, I would describe some of the situations and some of the populations that telemedicine might work for. So these are all things that I need to find out information about in my research. Now, if I wrote about telemedicine for my critique paper, I've probably already found some useful information and some sources that I want to actually use in my final paper, in which case you can also use those sources for your annotated bibliography, but you're going to need to find at least one more because you have to write 3 entries. So what you would consider now is, okay, I have to write my own paper, convincing readers that telemedicine is something that they should support or try or whatever it is you decide to focus on. So now, what kinds of evidence am I going to need? And then I start searching for it. So the introduction tells me your topic and what you hope to argue, and you do need to have an idea of that before you can work further on the annotated bibliography. So take some time to consider, what topic are you interested in? If you are going further with your critique, what specifically is the opinion or position that you want to argue, that you want to persuade your reader to believe in along with you in this final paper? And then we're going to take that and we're going to research, look for sources that could help us write that paper. And in your annotated bibliography, you're going to specifically tell me, how do you think these 3 sources will help you write your paper? So it'll help me to see that you're on the right track, and it will help you to plan. And this will be a really good first step in writing your final paper. After the introduction paragraph, you then move on to the body of the annotated bibliography, which is where you list your 3 sources and you write about them. So we call these bibliographic entries, and it's going to look a lot like a works cited page, but with extra information. So a bibliography is the same thing as a works cited. It's a list of sources. An annotated bibliography means we take that list of source and we annotate each one. We write notes on it. So this is just a more formalized way of taking notes on a source. And so we set it up initially like a works cited page. I've listed a citation of my source, its author, its title, all that good stuff. And then underneath the citation, I add a summary of my source and a short description of how I plan to use it. And so I like the works cited page. I'm going to list my sources in alphabetical order by the last name of the author. So what you might do is look at the works cited page you did for your critique. And if you're using those 2 sources for your annotated bibliography too, you could copy paste those citations, put them in the body of your annotated bibliography, and then under each one, you would write the paragraph that you need. And then, of course, you would need to find a 3rd source as well, because you still need to conduct some new research for the annotated bibliography. Or maybe you only use 1 source from your critique and find 2 new ones, or maybe you're not using any of them and you're changing your topic, or you just want better sources. Then you're going to find 3 sources for the annotated bibliography. So what it's going to look like is this. I have my citation just like it would be on a works cited page. So imagine my introduction is up here. I've skipped a space, started a new paragraph, and that paragraph actually begins with a citation. And then underneath it, I'm going to write a 2 to 4 sentence summary of this source, and then 2 to 4 sentences about how I plan to use it in my argumentative research paper. And so this comes from the example I was using for the critique paper. I made up the topic of video games as useful tools for helping us learn about morals and ethics. And throughout last week's module and the beginning of this week's module, I used that example to show you guys how to write critique paragraphs and how to write a synthesis. And so I had 3 sources for my topic, and this was one of them. This was my scholarly article, Moral Foundations Theory and Moral Reasoning in Video Game Play, Using Real-Life Morality in a Game Context. And so in my critique, I had written a short summary of that source, and then I had also critiqued it, right, based on 3 criteria. I judged its credibility, I judged its research, I judged its use of evidence. Now, I'm not going to copy paste all of that into my annotated bibliography, right? I can copy and paste the summary I wrote before if I think it's a good one. But now the second part of the annotated bibliography entry that is like but different from the critique is I'm no longer judging whether or not the source is good in general. I'm now deciding, how is it good for my paper? What will it help me to argue or inform or write about in my argumentative research paper? And so here I get a little bit more specific. I say, okay, in this source, I found out some data about this thing. I found out a definition that's useful for me to talk about that other thing. And so I really sit down and consider, how could I use this source in my own paper? I'm not going to use all of its information, right? I'm not supposed to just be repeating information from other sources. My final paper has to be my own argument. So I'm going to have some quotes or paraphrases from other sources, but they're only going to be used to help me make my points. And so you should really look back at your source and say, what are 1 or 2 things that this source could help me to do in my own paper? What kind of useful information does it have that I might want to cite in my paper? And get more specific. And so we can take a look at an example of that. I will show you how I can look back at my critique paper, and if I find one of my sources useful, how I could revise it to turn it into an annotated bibliography entry. And so you'll be able to reuse some of the work you already did, and then add a new element that's really going to help you in writing your final paper. So all of these assignments have been meant to build on each other and help you with the next one, even to the extent that I don't mind if you reuse pieces of it, because it's meant to help you grow and develop knowledge and research and eventually your own critical opinion that you will try to persuade your readers of. And so this research you've already done could hopefully still be useful to you now as well. So let's take a look at my previous critique paragraph on this source and what I could do with it to make it an annotated bibliography entry. All right, so let's take a look at my example critique essay that I wrote for you guys. So here was my critique, Moral and Ethical Decision-Making in Video Games, a Critique of Sources. And I had an introduction, and then I started a critique paragraph for one of my sources, and I had 2 paragraphs for that source actually. And then I had my second source, which just had 1 paragraph. And then I had my third source, which I had written, I believe, 2 paragraphs about, and then there was my synthesis, right? So if I decide to continue with the same topic for my final paper, I might use, now you guys only had to do 2 sources for your critique, so you might decide to use both of them, one of them, or none of them for your annotated bibliography. So when I look at mine, if you remember, I had said that the one source, the article for Game Rant, I didn't find the most credible or useful, so I would probably decide when I'm sitting down to consider, what do I need when I write my own paper? What kind of information and evidence will be useful for me? I had actually said when I read this that I couldn't find a lot of information about the author, and that while it taught me more about a specific game, that I figured for a larger paper that I wrote, I could just play games myself and find evidence or talk to other people who play them. So I'm actually going to just completely delete this and say I'm not going to use this for my annotated bibliography. And I might use this other source, but again, only use the sources from your critique if you think they actually are going to help you write your final paper. And then you have to decide specifically, how do you think they're going to help you write your paper? So I can keep my summary because I do need to summarize my source, but where I talk about my 3 criteria, that was part of the critique paper. It is not part of the annotated bibliography, so most of that's probably going to get deleted, and I have to write new information. So what I want to do first is actually go on down to my Works Cited page, and I'm going to copy paste my citation, or I'm just going to cut it actually, because your annotated bibliography won't need a Works Cited page. It's actually just going to cite within the body of the paper. So let's change this to an annotated bibliography. I do recommend starting like a new document for your actual annotated bibliography, but I just want to show you this here. So this was the introduction to my critique. That's going to get, I might be able to use some of it for my annotated bibliography entry, but for the most part, I'm going to have to write a new introduction. But let's keep it here for now and pretend this is my introduction to my annotated bibliography, which I am going to talk about how to write one in next week's module. So after my introduction comes my 3 sources that I annotate. So I am going to copy paste my citation here. So I'm going to move that down, and then I have this here. Now I actually want this to, I want the first line of the source to be left, aligned to the left like normal, and then you have the hanging indent here. And I want my paragraph to actually line up too. So if I do that, it'll be all lined up nicely. So let's look and see where my summary ended. So I say, these people wrote it, here's what it's about. And it looks like right here is where I started my critique. So I am just going to space that down here. And I'm most likely going to delete all of that. So I would have my source, the citation for it. I would summarize it in 2 to 4 sentences, and then in 2 to 4 more sentences in this paragraph, I am going to tell you how I plan to use this source in my own final paper in which I make an argument. So this means that I'm probably going to need to read back over the article, figure out what might be useful about it, and then tell you about that here. Now, it's possible that in your critique paragraph, when you discussed the credibility or whatever other evidence, you were looking at for why the source was valuable or not, you might have already hit upon some things that would help you write your paper. Now, this part doesn't really matter. It's not going to help my paper to just talk about the credibility of the author. So that's definitely not going to go into my annotated bibliography in any way. Now, I do say that one of the things I liked about this article was that it had good research. Now, my job would be to consider what research and specifically was so useful that I might put it in my own paper. So here I described something pretty vaguely, that they talked about moral philosophy and the well-known moral foundations theory. So that's not really specific enough. So I'm just going to delete that too. Now here was where in my critique paragraph, I happened to talk about very specific information from the article that I thought was good, that it was a good example of evidence that the authors used. So maybe I want to use it as evidence in my own paper. So I might take a look back at this and see if maybe I can include some of this in my annotated paragraph, or at least I could summarize it. So what I had decided was valuable and interesting about this source was that the authors had conducted a study of their own, a new original study. And maybe this would be useful for me to cite this study as evidence in my own paper. So let's see. These authors were able to support their argument evidence from their subjects, real video game players who explained how their previous game experiences and actual morals and life experiences affected their choices. For example, the study showed that 37.6% of the decisions made among players specifically related to the theory of harm care, which refers to whether or not someone cared for someone weak or vulnerable. Other moral decisions involved other stuff, which I didn't get as specific about. So maybe that data is useful in my own paper. I need to sit and think about that. What is my argument for my final paper? What kind of things do I think I'll need to persuade my reader of? What about this article might help me to do that? Now, I don't have to plan everything out in my annotated bibliography. I'm just giving some ideas. So for now, I'm thinking my final paper is going to be about how video games offer new opportunities for ethical thinking and moral exercises for our brains and our empathy, and that this is something people should pay attention to, and that maybe video games should be treated as an art form as serious as literature, because it's evolving to offer us serious meditations about life. Let's take a look back actually at the sample thesis statement I wrote for the annotated bibliography. All right, so back in the previous pages in the module, I had introduced the argumentative research paper briefly, and then we had shifted to the annotated bibliography. But I had given you some examples of possible thesis statements or ideas for topics for a final paper. And so one of them was video games are not just simple entertainment. They can teach us about humanity and social issues in unique ways, right? So maybe that's the thesis statement I start with, and then I make it more specific as I go and say, well, I want to focus specifically on not just like humanity and social issues, that's a really big category, but I focus specifically on morals and ethics, how games can help us think about those and practice decisions and teach us a lot about, the choices we make in life. And so I thought to myself, in a paper like this, I would have to challenge a popular conception that video games are not as serious as other forms of art and communication, like literature. I would need to provide evidence that there are games which engage with serious topics and offer proof that these games have influenced players to reflect on humanity in valuable ways. This would require a persuasive tone of writing and good research to back me up. I would need to convince readers also of the importance of my topic. Why does it matter? So part of the annotated bibliography is saying, okay, what kind of research do I need? What kind of proof do I need to back me up? And I found a source that gives me a good example of something I could use. And so if I go back to the critique and I say, okay, I did find some good information here that I do want to use in my final paper, so I can tell my reader about that in my annotated bibliography. So I am going to actually use some of my critique, and I'm going to move it back up here. Now I'm not going to just copy paste. I need to revise, I need to add things, but I did want to show you that it's possible that you can reuse some of your critique as long as you're building on it. Now the rest of my critique, I'm not using that. That doesn't really fit in with what I'm doing here. And so this part is my summary of my source, right? 2 to 4 sentences. And then I move on to my plans for how I could use this source in my final paper. So this was what I copy pasted. I'm going to need to rearrange it a little bit. So I am going to introduce it with a broad statement and say, this source provides me with helpful data to support my paper's argument that video games do offer opportunities for players to practice their moral and ethical. For example, the author's study showed that 37.6% of decisions made among players specifically related to the theory of harmed care, which refers to whether or not someone cared for someone weak or vulnerable. All right, so I'm starting to tell you my plans here, that this is one thing I think that from this source I could really use in my paper. And so I give that specific evidence, and then I say I can use this data, right? And then I tell you how I think this might actually help my paper. I can use this data when I discuss how, despite the concern that exists about video game violence, there are combat games like Fallout 3, which the authors study here, in which players are given the choice to help others and solve some problems non-violently. Kiersmar's and Single's research gives me evidence that players actively consider the moral and ethical ramifications of their choices within games, which will help me prove that video games offer a unique opportunity as an art form to directly engage us in ethical and moral decision-making. Okay, so you can see that the second half of this paragraph, right, my annotated bibliography entry, so I have my summary, and then I give you very specific plans for how I could use part of this paper, part of this source, in my own argument. Now, you might not have ideas yet that are as specific as this, and that's okay. I'm also going to show you a more general example, because you might see one source that you were like, oh yeah, this has like a particular quotation that I definitely want to use, and I know how it's going to help my paper. But you're still thinking about your paper. You've barely even started it yet. So it's okay if you don't have quite this much to say about it yet. But I do really encourage you, if you are using the same sources or any of the sources from your critique, to look back at the critique itself and look back at the source and try to find if there's anything specific that you feel would help you write your paper. But don't just tell me it has good evidence I can use in my paper. Really sit and think about it for a little bit and ask yourself, well, what does this evidence mean for my argument? What will it help me to show or prove or make my readers understand? And that's going to really help you plan for your paper, because now that I've thought this out in my annotated bibliography, I know a potential paragraph in my paper now, in my argumentative research paper, in which I can introduce Kiersmar and Single's research, a particular quotation, maybe another one by the time I get to my paper, I'll find something else, and then I can persuade my reader that what that data means is what I'm arguing, right? Because the rest of this is my plan for what I want to say in my paper and simply explains how this source can help me do it. So you really want to use the annotated bibliography as an opportunity to start planning your paper and thinking about how sources can be helpful, but not take over your paper. Your opinions, what you want to convince your reader of, is ultimately the most important thing.